Have you ever visited Mexington, Kentucky? Or do you know what a Kentubano is? Latino influences are all around us in Kentucky, but they can often be overlooked. Join us today for a discussion with a historian who has written an article on Latino migration into Kentucky and who will help us understand how Latinos are helping to remake the Commonwealth as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society, or who have contributed to the scholarly journal, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which has been published continuously since 1903. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Eladio Bobadilla is an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. He received his PhD from Duke University. He has published articles in California History and History Now, and is currently working on his first book manuscript, No More Backdoors, A History of the Immigrants Rights Movement. In 2023, he published I Feel Like This Is My Home, Immigration and the Making of Latino Kentucky. This article appeared in a special joint issue of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society and the Journal of Arizona History in autumn 2023. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So we have talked with a couple of folks who are part of the special joint issue with the Journal of Arizona History. But could you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this article on the Making of Latino Kentucky?
Sure. I got to Kentucky in 2019. Before that, I was a grad student at Duke. So this was my first academic job, and I was really thrilled and happy to get this job, to have a job,
Yeah.
and to have a good one, and to be in a place that was exciting and had so much to offer. So I was thrilled to just be there. And then I think I can't remember exactly when, because the last few years have all felt like a blur, but it must have been around 2021 or 22 that Laura Key reached out and said, "Hey, it's cool that Kentucky has a historian of Latinos now, and would you be interested in writing about Latinos in the state?" And I was happy to do it, although I'm not at all a historian of Kentucky. I write a lot about what has happened out west in the last 30, 40 years. And so that's my specialty. That's what I do. I write a lot about California, about some stuff about Texas, and then I've really become interested in the national kind of policy story, but I'd never really considered the history of Latinos in Kentucky. So I was intrigued and really thrilled to get into it. And I was just delighted to kind of learn about it, because I honestly didn't know that much myself about Latinos in Kentucky. So I started reading and digging into it, and then I wrote the piece, and it's out there now. So it's exciting.
Just kind of a side question. How was it as a Duke grad at Kentucky?
It's fun because there was always that banter with students and with the community. So I remember like a lot of the comments when I first got there, and they're like, who decided to hire a Duke guy at Kentucky? And it was all really banter. People were wonderful and nice and kind, but that was always really fun. And every now and then, when Duke and Kentucky would play basketball games, I'd have a friendly wager with my students or something. I'll do something along the lines of, if your alma mater wins, you get an extra free day off or something. And if I never punished them if Duke won, but it was always fun to have that banter and that conversation with students. Actually, I got an email yesterday from one of the students at Kentucky who saw that Duke was playing Pitt. So there's this ongoing conversation with students that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I feel like the Pitt-Duke rivalry is not going to be quite.
It's not quite going to be as intense, but I did hear from a UK student about it, so they must remember my little wagers And that was always a lot of fun. And it was great because when Duke and Kentucky played, I felt like I couldn't lose.
No, that's two good teams to have right there. I
Yeah,
guess I mean
sure.
you can't go wrong with that. That does kind of segue into my second question though, and you talked about this briefly in your answer to the first question. When you got to Kentucky, did you know about this as being a potential area of research? I'll get into the article in a little bit, but like Mexington, did you realize that there were sort of pockets or Latino communities within Kentucky, or was that something that really you did not expect, and as you were thinking about this potential article, that you developed as you went?
Well, I knew from my own work that the story of migration, of Latino migration, uh, could no longer be told as one that happened exclusively in the Southwest. I mean, after the 80s and certainly the 90s, the Latino community really spread out throughout the country. And so I knew that there was a large presence in the Midwest, and parts of the East Coast. So I knew that there had to be a community and that there had to be a story. But I'm not an expert at all in that particular region. So when I got the job, as you might expect, I was so excited and happy that, given the job market, how terrible it is, that I got a really good job. I read about it a lot. I read about Kentucky. I read about Lexington. I looked up, where am I going to eat? Where am I going to spend my time? And I came across, stories about Stephen Alvarez, who had been there before I got there. So I think by the time I got to Kentucky, he had moved on. I think to St. John's. I believe I could be wrong, but I think that's right. But he had created this class called something like taco literacy,
It's a great
and
title. It's a
yeah,
great
yeah, and
title.
he wrote pretty extensively about Mexington. And so it was exciting. It was really cool. I mean, I had lived in North Carolina before that. And then before that, I went to college in Utah. So Mexican food, which, I grew up with and I love, and it's my thing, and, it's it's home, had been missing for a while. And so I never imagined that I would find it again in a place like Kentucky, but I did. It was really exciting to learn about it and to learn how the Mexican and more broadly Latino community had made a home there and had created their own kind of history and left a footprint in the city and in the state. So I learned about it sort of just from a selfish perspective of wanting to know, how does a Mexican guy coming to Kentucky find good Mexican food, and how do I find my people in a sense. And it was less an academic, exercise than again just sort of thinking about, where do I fit into this place? Where will I fit, or how will I fit into this place?
It's an interesting thing, though. My wife grew up in San Diego,
Mhm.
and we ended up meeting in Alabama. So she would always complain about, especially Mexican food, that there was nowhere that she felt like could sort of recreate San Diego.
Yeah.
Wherever you went, there was just nothing that could kind of match that. And I grew up on the East Coast, so for me, it didn't have that same sort of sense of okay, we've got to find something here that connects. So that's an interesting part. Before we get into the actual food part of the story, which I do want to delve into because I found that fascinating with the article itself, can you talk a little bit more about Latino migration into Kentucky, sort of the broader trends, what we see there? So before we set up sort of the story of specific places in Kentucky, what sort of broader trends do we see about Kentucky as the South, or as a place you might not expect with Latino migration?
Yeah, so Kentucky was an interesting destination for Latinos, and it really started to become a favored destination, or at least one that was on the radar of more and more people in the 1990s. And that happens for a couple of reasons, for two main reasons. The first is that the Southwest, kind of loses its luster. For a long time, Latino migrants saw California and Texas as a preferred destination because that's where the jobs were, and that's where the community was. So that's where established Latino communities existed, and so that made life easier for immigrants. They could show up and find family members. They could show up and find churches that offered services in Spanish. They could, just show up and find grocery stores and restaurants and the kind of thing we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure. But they could find that community already established. And, I think of my own parents, for example, who are now elderly, but we moved to Delano, California. So I was an immigrant myself, and my parents, of course, immigrants. And we landed there because we had family there, and because they had opportunities for work there in the fields. And it wasn't, it was terrible work in a lot of ways. It was difficult and low paying, but it was fairly secure. They could always find work. So that's where people went. Um, by the mid 1990s, job markets are pretty saturated, so increasingly the pay is low and competition is pretty fierce. So there's too many people to really be able to find the opportunity that immigrants sought out. So they start to look at other places, and often that's the South. Often it's places in the Northeast, but also the Midwest. And Kentucky's this interesting place that is kind of both, or maybe
Yes.
neither, right? As you
Hmm.
as probably better than anyone knows, it's this a little bit of an identity crisis, I think. What is Kentucky? Is it the Midwest? Is it the South? Well, and maybe it doesn't matter, right? And for immigrants, it didn't necessarily matter, but they were looking for new places to find opportunity, and there was work in agriculture here. Of course, the horse industry offered opportunities, service industry, and there weren't that many immigrant communities to compete with. So the work that the Latinos often found, they could find it more easily in Kentucky. Places like Kentucky, certainly Kentucky was part of that story and became part of that story. And then the second reason why a lot of folks chose to migrate to Kentucky was that um, immigration control was minimal, almost non-existent, as I write in the piece. And so, especially for undocumented people, they could find a little bit more peace in a place like Kentucky. Um, and especially in the 1990s, when places like California are going after immigrants and passing these very restrictive xenophobic laws like Proposition 187 in 1994. And migrants felt threatened. So some of the migration is people coming from Mexico, from Central America, and just choosing to start off in a place like Kentucky because again, the jobs are there, and migration control is less of a problem. But then you also have internal migration, people that are already living in places like California and who decide that there are no good jobs anymore,
Hmm.
and immigration laws like the kind that that I just mentioned, Prop 187, is making life miserable for them and for their kids and their families. So they try to find new places to start, to start over. And Kentucky becomes attractive for those two reasons. There are the job market isn't as saturated, and there's a great deal of demand for, I hate this phrase, but for low skilled work, or what's called that sometimes, or unskilled work, um, for manual labor, right?
Hmm.
Construction, horse industry, service industries. So people find jobs here, and they find that it's less of a threat in terms of immigration control. And those are the two primary reasons, at least for not non-Cuban immigrants. And I think I don't know if you want to talk about them, but for especially for undocumented people or people who have undocumented family members, those are the two primary reasons why Kentucky becomes so attractive.
And that was a piece I'd never thought about before until I read your article, and I was thinking about that. That makes a lot of sense with the laws that are being passed, with Kentucky sort of being unknown.
Yeah,
In that sense, it's not an area. It's not by any stretch of the imagination like what we think of as a border state.
right.
If you think about Kentucky as a border state, we're talking as a Midwest or as South. Civil War.
Yeah,
It has a completely different, even sort of place in the national imagination
yeah,
than Texas or California do. I think that's one of the reasons it kind of gets ignored or as an issue that we don't tend to focus on it as much is because of that. But that does really nicely kind of bring me to my next question, which is, can you talk about how some of these communities get started, or what sort of the pull factor for communities developing, not just bringing individuals in? The two things I found fascinating in reading your article was your elaboration of what Mexington was, because I had never heard of it before, and all of a sudden you developed that so well. But also a Cuban community in Louisville. How do we see these sort of small communities develop? What impact do they have on Kentucky as a whole?
Yeah, so it always starts out with smaller groups, wanting to find something they can't find anywhere else. And I mentioned a couple of those reasons, to find better jobs, um, or at least to find labor markets that aren't as saturated, and then the desire to have more kind of freedom. And so in that way, the Cuban community that you see in Louisville and the Mexican and Central American communities that you see in places like Lexington are not that different. They're just looking for opportunity, and they feel that the traditional destinations are no longer providing it, for whatever reason, often because, as I mentioned, labor markets seem or feel or are saturated. Once you get a couple of smaller communities, then that becomes a little bit more attractive to later migrants, right? Who might find some of that familiarity there that they might have had in places like California or Texas, or for Cubans, Florida. Um, you know, uh, Migrant communities set up small businesses, often a small restaurant or a grocery store, and often initially they cater not to other Latinos because they don't really exist, but maybe for people who want the novelty of a Cuban restaurant, or who are looking for a good Mexican joint and have it. But as that develops, then more people are drawn to it, and the larger those communities become, the more attractive they are as a destination to new waves of migrants, which is how you get, big communities in the Southwest. Although it's easier there because of the proximity to the border, but that happens in Kentucky too, right? Communities grow, they develop, they become more established, and then that makes it increasingly, gradually more attractive and easier for new folks to come and join them.
And I think sometimes for it can be easy to overlook until you go down the street and all of a sudden you see a Cuban restaurant. You're like, oh, there's a restaurant here, and then all of a sudden you start noticing, okay, like, yeah, I can understand what's taking place here. But that does lead into another question, and I've never read, or we haven't interviewed someone, I should say, on the podcast who's written about food in a sort of meaningful way.
Mm.
So when you're doing this research, do you test out the places that you talk about in the article? Do you go out there and go, was it somewhere that you were familiar with beforehand that you kind of go, okay, this actually fits what I'm working on, and it's just sort of an added bonus that you get to test out the food?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, by the time I was asked to write this, I was already an expert in that part of it. I was certainly an expert in the food, and in Mexican food. Yeah, I had favorites. I still think about them often. Um, but yeah, no, it was interesting to think about it in a more academic way. So
Hmm.
I had never really considered it in that sense. It was just, I'm glad there's these good restaurants here and these wonderful Mexican places. And I remember I read about this briefly at the beginning, but I remember when I first got to Kentucky, going over to Taqueria Ramirez, which is kind of the well-known, one of the more well-known places in Lexington. And I heard a siren. As you do, you look over it. It's this fire truck with the word bomberos on it. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And I'd never seen that in California. Like, I had
Hmm.
never seen a fire truck with the word firefighters or fire department in Spanish. And I saw that for the first time in Kentucky. And then I really started thinking about what those communities mean, and how they've become these really unique centers of cultural and social life. to the point that, the city's acknowledging that, the
Mhm.
fire department is acknowledging it, and their identity is shaped by this growing Latino community. But you asked about food, and yeah, no, I mean, the moment I got to Kentucky, I was excited about Mexington, finally having good Mexican restaurants, and I think I've tried, I don't know, couple dozen over the years, over the 4 years that I was there. So yeah, no, by the time I was asked to write this, I was already an expert in that part of it.
Was that difficult as a historian? Because, I mean, would you consider yourself a labor historian? Is that sort of how
Mhm.
you class? Was it somewhat difficult to sort of work food in there, or was that something that you felt was relatively? I'm just thinking of how academics we divide ourselves in certain ways, and sometimes we see this as sort of being, as you mentioned, sometimes we don't see foodways as being as academic, but I mean, you showed it. It can easily be worked into.
It wasn't difficult, and I'm not a food historian, but I think, yeah, again, like you say here, the part of the problem about these conversations is that we define ourselves in such narrow ways that sometimes that becomes a hindrance.
Mhm.
I don't know. I think of myself, I guess, as a social movements historian, which
Okay.
includes labor and includes race and ethnicity and the working class. And certainly, I mean, food is critical to working class life. It's critical. It's essential to immigrant life. It's how we build community. It's how we, build family. It's how build up family. It's how we celebrate. It's how we grieve, even, right? Um, yeah, every part of our lives, from births to funerals, is often, um, has food as a backdrop. Uh, and to me, it made perfect sense to talk about food, um, as a way that communities build the familiar that doesn't already exist, build community. It's the way that often they make a living, and folks who work in restaurants, folks who start businesses, who start restaurants, who create these wonderful establishments. Yeah, food is everywhere. Food is labor. Food is community. Food is identity. And so it made sense to talk about it, and to think about food as central to the Latino experience in Kentucky.
I think for us as a public history institution, trying to tell the stories of the people who make up Kentucky is sort of our goal. So reading your article, I think that helps us because I do think, sometimes we can delve into sort of high politics or, you go into a building and it's just politicians or this or that. And I think telling that full experience of the people who comprise Kentucky is important. Now, the last question is one I always ask. Usually, I say this for researchers who are here doing the fellowship program. So it's sort of a, what did you find interesting about Kentucky from an outsider perspective? But you were here for a while. Um, is there anything that you miss about Kentucky? I know this doesn't have to go too deep, but is there anything that you sort of, if you're back in the area or if you visit, that you miss about Kentucky or that you really enjoyed when you were living in this area?
Yeah, there's a lot that I miss about Kentucky. Um, my department, my
Mhm.
colleagues. I mean, I left, for reasons that made sense for my career and my family, things that we needed that make more sense here. But I always had such fond feelings about my colleagues and about the department and about the university. We talked about basketball briefly, and I still very much root for Kentucky. It was the place that gave me my first shot as a
Mhm.
professional, as a professor. So I'll always have incredibly fond feelings, for the university, for the community. Um, yeah, certainly the people of Kentucky are wonderful, good, hardworking, honest people, who will give you the shirts off their backs, and that's, I'm talking about just about anyone in Kentucky. So I read about Latinos here, but anyone, in Kentucky that you encounter day to day is likely to be just a wonderful person, hardworking, honest, good person. So I miss the people, my people, but also just the people, of the
Yeah.
state and of the city. I miss Kentucky basketball, and I really miss the food. Pittsburgh has great food, and we have lots of wonderful restaurants. But Mexican food is not good.
Okay. I was
I
going
have
to
yet
ask
to
that. I was
find.
going to ask that.
No, there's good food, just not good Mexican food. I have struggled to find decent Mexican food, and I can off the top of my head tell you 4 or 5 of my favorites in Kentucky, but I've yet to find a good Mexican joint here. So the search continues, and I think eventually something's got to give. We've got to find something, but I certainly miss how easy it was to find good Mexican food in Lexington and in Kentucky.
That's what I would tell our listeners as well. If you are in Kentucky, go check out some of those places. If you're
Yes.
not familiar with them, I encourage everyone to read the article, of course, and that's what we're trying to do here. But check out the places, support.
Yeah.
The food scene is good. So I was thinking you were going to go with the weather, because I'd imagine with Pittsburgh, it's gonna, especially this time of the year, it's going to be a little bit.
Yeah, the weather I can adapt to. The lack of Mexican food is hard.
Okay, that's a
I
good.
think that's the harder part. Yeah, yeah. Finding a good Mexican joint it continues to be a mission for me, and it's something that I really miss.
Well, I think that's honestly a good way for us to end this podcast. So thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your article.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Latinos have influenced Kentucky and will continue to shape the state into the future. We are grateful to historians like Dr. Bobadilla, who are working hard to bring these stories to light. His remarks remind us that individuals from a wide variety of backgrounds and places have contributed to the construction of the state that we call home. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Eladio Bobadilla, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.